with everybody. So I'm going to kick off this webinar. My name is Holger Schünemann. I work at McMaster University, and I'm co-chair of the Guidelines International Network and INTA working group. And I'll just go to Muna to introduce herself, and then we'll go in order with the speakers a little bit later.
Hello everyone. So my name is Muna Jameldin. I'm working on the head of the HTA department actually at INEA, so the National Authority for Assessment and Accreditation in Healthcare in Tunisia. I'm also an INATA board member, and I'm the co-chair of GINAHTA, and I've taken over Brian O'Rourke, who is retiring soon. And I want really to take this opportunity to pay a tribute to him for all what he's done for the HTA community, for all the positions that he's held. Thank you.
Okay, and that is excellent. So here we go. Okay, so I'm just showing the program for today. I will make a few announcements and then take you through the detailed program. We are trying to keep the introductions to this webinar fairly brief and focus on our two speakers for today, Dalia Dawood and Shelly ONeill, who are really the opening speakers in this webinar series that we have thought to kick off for the Guidelines International Network and INTA. You're seeing the program here. Actually, what we're doing is that I myself, Holger Schünemann, and Muna are doing some introductions around the Guidelines International Network, INTA, and the working group. And then we will be speaking about the two projects that, or the two topics that we have selected for today. Just a few housekeeping announcements. The webinar is going to be recorded, and I'm just checking with Jenna that is really the case. It says recording here, that we will make this webinar available to anybody who is interested, so outside of GIN and INATA. A few other just housekeeping announcements are that we will try to have this webinar as interactive as possible. So when it comes to questions and answers a little bit later, we'll take definitely questions through the dashboard or the chat, obviously. And we will see if we can also manage to have live comments from individuals. That always depends a little bit on how many people want to speak. So the general encouragement is to suggest to submit questions through the chat, but hopefully we can do more than that. And we now have 111 attendees, and it's time to get started. So the first section really is a very brief introduction to the work that we have been doing as INATA and as GIN. So I'll start this right here. So the idea really of the Guidelines International Network and INATA partnership is to bring guidelines and health technology assessment together. Muna and I are chairing this group. I'll do my brief intro about GIN and GINAHTA. The views that I express are my own. I am a board member of the Guidelines International Network, and I also wear two other hats with Cochrane and the great working group that are relevant for today. The Guidelines International Network has a big mission, which is to lead, strengthen, and support collaboration within the guideline development, adaptation, and implementation community. GIN is a network, as by its name, so it facilitates networking, promotes excellence, and helps our members to create high-quality clinical practice guidelines that foster safe and effective patient care. GIN is structured into regional communities, working groups. It has an international conference that rotates throughout the world, and it conducts webinar in this context. The reason for today's work and the work of the Guidelines International Network is really that there's a lot of overlap between the Guidelines International, between guideline development and health technology assessment. And we have long been talking in the GINAHTA working group about highlighting examples where the coordinated health technology assessment and guideline development process actually works. And you see that guideline development from a guideline developer point of view carries a lot of similarities, overlap with health technology assessment. It's a complex process. This is from the GINAHTA checklist on guideline development of a tool. So it's obviously all of these complex issues around organization, conflict of interest, considerations, good documentation, many different stakeholders involved, and then it is about evidence that might include also modeling and cost. For GINAHTA, before I turn it over to Muna, GINAHTA's main objective is really to explore these common methods and to facilitate collaboration and sharing of products between these two communities. That is increasingly taking place, sometimes in-house within the same agency, sometimes across some bridges, to identify complementarities between the products of both communities and elaborate on a platform to promote collaboration and the sharing of products. So without much else being said, or without saying much more rather, I will turn it over to Muna, and Muna just emailed me her slides, so I will be advancing her slides. But Muna, if you start speaking, that's great, and you just tell me next slide, please.
Okay, next slide, please. Thank you, Holger, for this quick presentation on GIN and GINAHTA. So I will make a small presentation on INTA as well. So INTA is the International Network of Agencies for Health Technology Assessment. It reunites 50 agencies in 31 countries. So as you can see, INTA has members in almost every corner of the globe. Next, please. So what is unique about INTA is that all INTA members are publicly funded HTA body that assesses healthcare technology and that relate to regional or national government. Next, please. So the main mission of INTA is to connect and empower these HTA bodies and enable a continuous learning and an exchange of knowledge among the member agency, and its other mission is to demonstrate the value of HTA body as key components of modern health system in order to support robust decision making based on the best available scientific evidence, and at the end to create a better health policy around the globe. Next, please. So INTA is led by an elected board of directors. Next, please. So INTA has many programs and activity the year round. It has many learning groups and working groups. INTA is also leading and convening global collaborations, such as, for example, the collaboration with Guidelines International Network, which aims to share knowledge, harmonize methods, and enhance the collaboration between the two communities. Next, please. And this is how, at the end, the GINAHTA working group was born. INTA has also a global collaboration with with WHO and other international HTA network. Next, please. So if you have any question about INTA, don't hesitate to contact Tara Schuler, our executive manager. Thank you, Holger.
Great, thanks, Muna. So, as I said, without spending more time, we'll come to our first speaker again. The goal for us is to really look at these commonalities, look at examples of good collaboration between these two communities. And Dalia, I will turn it over to you. So Dalia is a scientific advisor in the Science Policy and Research Program at NICE in the UK. And we'll leave introductions, as I said, to yourself. That way you ensure that you can say what you want to say about yourself. We are really pleased to have you and thankful for you making the time. Dalia, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Holger, for the introduction and for inviting me to present at today's webinar. So I'll start sharing my screen. If you can give me control, that would be great.
Yeah, you should be able to do that.
Just a quick reminder for all attendees to submit their question in the chat box during the presentation.
So I hope you can see my slides at the moment. Perfect. So as I said, I'm a scientific advisor at the NICE Science Policy and Research team. And I'm very happy to be presenting today at this webinar because it touches on a topic that is really dear to my heart. So I've been working on guidelines and health technology assessment over the last 10 years. And I've always felt that there is a lot of scope for improvement in terms of how we work together as two important guidance products that inform evidence-based practice. I've been with NICE specifically for the last year and a half, and have worked in the TA team, but before that I was working on guideline development at NICE collaborating centers as well. I will be presenting today on HTX, which is the next generation health technology assessment project. This is an EU-funded project that is led by the University of Utrecht. It's a large consortium of 15 partners. And the reason for presenting on the project is that it touches in a major work package on the synergies between clinical guidelines and technology assessment. So as a background, as we all know, and that's why GINAHTA was born, really aligning health technology assessment and clinical practice guideline recommendation is an essential task, but it's really challenging one because timely and consistent and coordinated guidance is required now more than ever. As we can see with the current pandemic situation, the need for clear clinical practice or clear guidance for the key workers, for the frontline clinicians who are working on the ground and dealing with patient care. So they need to have these timely, consistent, and coordinated guidance in a way that can inform them to inform their practice and ensure that it's evidence-based. But this involves a lot of organization, and we need to really harmonize methods, processes, and outputs across all sides. So this cannot be done by one team at a time. It has to be a collaboration between the two sides. It really takes two to tango, as they say. And I really commend Guidelines International Network and INTA for making the start and the establishment of GINAHTA to work on this collaboration and make it a priority. And for NICE specifically, it's a priority area because NICE is an organization that produces both clinical guidelines and technology appraisals, and also a large number of other guidelines, not necessarily only the clinical practice guidelines. We also have a remit to cover public health guidance and social care as well. So the range and volume of our guidance creates internal challenges in keeping it up to date, but also making sure that we align our work programs and data management, as well as efficient analysis of the complex information that all our guidance teams work with. So that's why we have a major transformation project now going on at NICE, which is NICE Connect. And this aims to look at how, essentially, how we review, how we produce and how we present our guidance, and ensuring that what we produce is useful for our stakeholders, but ultimately how to ensure that our advice is implemented on the ground. And the main future looking product of our NICE Connect would hope that we would achieve having an advice and guidance that is integrated in a care pathway format, which represents the front door for our guidance users and our stakeholders, and to be able to get our guidance products and use them in an efficient way that can improve patient care. And I would invite you to have a quick look at our website. We have a 2-minute video introducing NICE Connect and the work that's currently going at the moment in this big transformation project. In parallel with that, we also have the CHTE methods review going on. So this is our Center of Health Technology Evaluation, and it looks at reviewing how we evaluate health technologies. This is a review of NICE methods for evaluating medicines, devices, and diagnostics. And at this is very much informed by looking also outside HTA methods and how clinical guidelines also work. So we ensure that there is alignment across the work of the institute. And our team, Science Policy and Research, we are focused on using research to inform the transformation of NICE and ensuring that our methods are future-proof. And this is a key priority, for one of our key priorities that you can also have a look at our page on NICE website, where we list our priority areas for research. And the main project I'm talking about today, which is HTX, or Next Generation Health Technology Assessment, is one of the projects that we are collaborators on. This is a European funded project, as I said. It's a Horizon 2020. It's a 5-year project that started in 2019 and will be running until 2023. And our consortium includes 15 partners and is led by the University of Utrecht. We also have two other HTA agencies included in this consortium. So we have TLB in Sweden and then in the Netherlands. And our main objectives in this project really is to try and create a framework for the next generation health technology assessment that is focused on supporting patient-centered, societally oriented, real-time decision-making. And this with the ultimate aim of being achieving integrated healthcare across Europe. And we do this by facilitating the development of methodologies to deliver more customized information on the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of complex and personalized combinations of health technologies. So really looking at the challenging and complex technologies that we need to assess and how we can develop methodologies based on the newest developments within the field that can help HTA organizations to assess them. With our ultimate aim really is to provide methods that will support personalized treatment advice that will be shared with patients and with physicians. So we have a huge focus on precision medicine and personalization of treatment, but we're also looking at sequences of treatment, for example. And these are things that clinical guidelines have had experience in, and we can definitely use this shared experience moving forward. The structure of our project is really built around work packages. So we have 6 work packages within the project. The main methodological work packages are work packages 2 and 3, which looks at the use of real-world data and its inclusion in evidence synthesis framework. And work package 3, which looks at the use of artificial intelligence methods in treatment prediction or treatment efficacy prediction, but also side effects. So using AI-based algorithm to inform care. And these methods are developed within 4 case studies that are part of work package 1, which focus on different disease areas. So we can see how these methods can work across different types of disease areas and across different interventions. So case 1 focuses on head and neck cancer, 2 is diabetes, and 3 is multiple sclerosis, and 4 is focused on myelodysplastic syndrome, which is a rare disease. In work package 4, we aim to focus on how the methods developed within these work packages will be implemented in terms of systems and processes for HTA, but also how we can integrate these developments and in aligning the work between HTA organizations and also between HTA organizations and regulatory agencies, as well as clinical guideline development organizations. So working on the synergies with clinical guidelines is one of the major tasks in this work package. And in this task, we aim to understand what is the current landscape of the synergies between clinical guidelines and technology and HTA recommendations, but also look at how we can improve this and how we can work together in a much more better and efficient way. So the methodology within this task is divided into 2 major parts. We are conducting a descriptive study where we are collecting data from HTA organizations and clinical guideline developers on the synergies between both sides. And the second part is the document review, and I will explain a little bit more next. This descriptive study, which is the first part of our work, aims to explore currently existing synergies between HTA developers and clinical guidelines. So both in terms of formal collaborations existing and also utilization of documents developed by both parties. And also we aim to identify the critical aspects where further improvement in these synergies is needed. And the methods we are using in this descriptive study are survey methods. Basically, we are conducting an online questionnaire as well as a workshop to expand on the discussion of the findings from the questionnaire. Our questionnaire development was done collaboratively between 5 members of the consortium, so University of Utrecht, TLV, University of Copenhagen, Zen, and NICE. And we worked on developing the questions included in the questionnaire based on the literature and expert input. And the format we chose for the questionnaire is an online administration format. And we tested also the validity and reliability of the questionnaire through expert review, as well as pilot testing. We administered the questionnaire consisted of a large number of sections that cover a number of other work packages in the project, but the section focused on the synergies with clinical guideline developers, or between clinical guideline developers and HTA organizations, covered 4 major areas. So what are the current experiences in terms of the case study areas for the respondent organizations, and then their arrangements for formal and informal collaboration. And because the questionnaire was administered first to HTA organizations, I'm putting here that it's formal and informal collaboration with clinical guideline developers, to HTA organization reflecting on collaboration with clinical guideline developers. Also on the benefits and challenges of closer working and the information needs. So what do we need from each other, and what can we benefit from each other? As I said, it was administered online through the Lime Survey platform. We disseminated the questionnaire to 28 organizations in 28 European countries. They are all GINAHTA partners. We did a pre-announcement before the survey went out to ensure participation, and we sent regular reminders. And I think this was very useful because we've got responses from 21 HTA organizations, which was a reasonable response rate to aim for. Data analysis is currently ongoing, and I will reflect a little bit on this in the next slide, but it's greatly helped by the Lime Survey tools as well. Clinical guideline developers will receive the questionnaire later this year, so please take time to complete it if it lands on your desk, basically. The preliminary results, and I just give a sneak preview of what we have found for 3 major questions, in my opinion, that we need to reflect on, and hopefully we'll see what will happen when we send the questionnaire to the clinical guideline developers. When we asked HTA organizations or respondent organizations about the use of HTA appraisals in clinical guidelines in their countries, 33% said yes, that HTA appraisal recommendations are used in clinical guidelines. But when we asked about whether formal collaboration already exists between HTA organizations and clinical guideline developers in your country, and was there any cooperation between HTA agencies and international guideline or European guideline developers exist, we only had 14% or 7 out of 21 organizations saying that they have this type of collaboration or cooperation already going on. So there is a huge room for improvement, in our opinion, that definitely organizations or initiatives such as GINAHTA can improve on. We also have a joint workshop planned later in the year. As I said, this was planned to be a face-to-face workshop between HTA organizations and clinical guideline developers. Participants were already identified and invited for this, and it was already planned for May, but we had to postpone it given the current situation. And it will take place later in the year. Hopefully we can reflect on the responses from the questionnaire, how we can improve, and what are the areas that we can work closer on from both sides, HTA, the views of both sides, HTA organizations and clinical guideline developers. And we will explore these in depth with the participants in the workshop. Our second part, as I indicated, will be a document review. This is just starting. And our aim in this document review is to look at the recommendations from 6 European HTA organizations and see if these are in line with recommendations from clinical guideline documents already available in these countries. We have chosen multiple sclerosis as an area to focus on in this case study. It's related to one of our case studies in work package 1, and it's an area where there is probably a need for this collaboration. The heavy use of sequences of treatments and combinations of treatments is really an area of interest for both guidelines and TA organizations going forward. So that's the end of my presentation, and I would like to acknowledge the team that is working on this major research project, but specifically our colleagues in University of Utrecht and Zen. Milo is a lead on this work. It's part of her PhD, and also our team at NICE who's working on this project, and our leads for NICE Connect and the CHTE methods review, also all the consortium partners. We have a website for the project and also a Twitter account and a LinkedIn, so please do follow our progress and get in touch if you are keen on collaborating with us on this work going forward. And thank you so much for listening.
Great, Dalia. Thank you. So, go ahead.
Thank you. I'll give
Go
you.
ahead. It's okay.
I'm just trying to see how I can give you control quick.
Thank you, Dalia. Very interesting. I think it's the first project of this kind. Very interesting. I suggest that we keep the question, answers, or clarification to the end. What do you think, Holger?
Yeah, that is absolutely fine. I don't see anything in the chat right now, so I think we can move on. And what we can do is we'll then take questions for Dalia and Shelly together. So if we can just move over, and Michelle, I will let you introduce yourself. You can start sharing your screen. I hope that works appropriately, and then we'll have conversation and discussion after that presentation.
Internationally, I want to focus here on the experience we've had within HIPAA, which is in Ireland. So just to introduce myself, I'm Shelly ONeill. I work in Health Information Technology Assessment in Directorate in HIPAA, it's Health Information Quality Authority in Ireland. Okay, can you move on slide, please? So this afternoon, I just want to describe our experience of the connection between clinical guidelines and technology assessment in Ireland. I'm going to run through 2 examples of hepatitis C screening and smoking cessation interventions. But first of all, I'm just going to give a small little background on how health technology assessment and clinical guidelines work in Ireland. Next slide, please. Oh, just back one. Great, thanks very much. So for health technology assessments within Ireland, the Health Information and Quality Authority in Ireland has a statutory function which says to evaluate the clinical and cost effectiveness of health technologies, including drugs, and provide advice arising out of the evaluation to the Minister and the Executive. The Executive here being the Public Health Service in Ireland. So essentially that statutory function is health technology assessment. We published our first health technology assessment in 2018, and to date we have 23 of these now published. So next slide, please. So clinical guidelines within Ireland, they fall under the National Clinical Effectiveness Committee. So this is a ministerial appointed committee that has the prioritizes and quality assures national and clinical guidelines. So they don't produce the guidelines within this committee. However, they do have guidance, methodologies that should be followed, and they quality assure and ensure that the guidelines that are published adhere to those standards. They also published, the first guideline was published in 2013, and oddly, they also have 23 published to date. It was recognized a few years ago that the lack of evidence synthesis or methodological support was a gap for the national clinical guidelines, which up to that point were essentially produced by clinicians in their spare time. So from 2017, a dedicated team, which is HRB CISER, was funded for 5 years, which provides evidence synthesis support to the NCEC, and this is hosted by HIPAA, where I work, and it's a collaboration with an academic institution, the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. So HICA produces evidence synthesis now for both HTA and clinical guidelines. I mean, essentially, there's quite a large overlap in the skills and methodologies needed to provide the evidence synthesis for both. So next slide, please. So to get into the first case example, which is hepatitis C screening. Just a little background in hepatitis C. It's a blood-borne virus that predominantly affects the liver. Chronic infection may lead to fibrosis, cirrhosis, liver transplantation, and potentially fatal complications. Progression tends to be slow and is often unpredictable. And with those who are chronically infected, may only becoming aware of the status upon development of cirrhosis and its complications. Recently, a highly effective treatment became available, which then enabled there to be an opportunity to identify and treat those undiagnosed. So essentially, screening became an awful lot more worthwhile when treatment was available. Based upon this, the clinical guideline hepatitis screening was published in 2017. And following that guideline, there was a recommendation to develop a HTA on hepatitis C for both birth cohort testing, which is currently in development and due for publication later this year. So next slide, please. So the hepatitis C guideline, which was published in 2017, was a broad guideline covering 27 different recommendations on who should be offered screening. So that included a normal range of, I think, 17 different risk groups, including illicit drug users, prisoners, migrants, healthcare workers, and so on. It also covered how screening should be undertaken. So, for example, what tests to use, point of care testing, rapid diagnostic tests, which specimens. So a broad guideline covering all aspects to do with hepatitis screening in Ireland. One of the recommendations, recommendation 20, was that birth cohort screening could not be recommended at present due to the likely substantial cost implications and uncertain benefit. Such a program would require full HTA and approval of funding prior to be considered. Birth cohort screening should be considered if a HTA shows to be cost effective and affordable in the Irish context. So that was the recommendation that came out of the clinical guideline, and quality of evidence was moderate, strength of recommendation was conditional or weak. So next slide, please. Following this recommendation, which clearly highlighted the need for a HTA, this led directly to the inclusion of a HTA on the HICA work programme. So in 2014, this HTA began. This HTA was looking at offering testing for hepatitis C to people in Ireland born between 1965 and 1985. And this again is due for completion later this year. The aim of the HTA is to establish the clinical and cost effectiveness of birth cohort testing for hepatitis C in Ireland. In addition, the HTA will look at the budget impact of this testing programme and assess the organisational, resource and ethical implications. Next slide, please. So that's a little bit about what happened for the hepatitis C. For the smoking cessation, so smoking cessation interventions, as we all know, this is a major public health problem, and Ireland is no different. Currently, 17% of people over the age of 15 years smoke within Ireland. Quitting smoking substantially reduces the risk of developing most smoking-related diseases. However, there are a range of interventions that are currently funded by the public health system in Ireland. Pharmacological interventions, behavioural interventions, prescription and non-prescription medications, as well as brief intervention and training. So the HTA on smoking interventions was published in 2017, and a clinical guideline on tobacco addiction is currently in development for publication in later on this year. Next slide, please. So the HTA on smoking interventions, which was published in 2017, was developed to inform policymakers on policymaking on the provision of smoking cessation. At the very outset of this HTA, it was intended that a clinical guideline would follow on using the information from the HTA. So at the very start of this project, unlike with the hepatitis C, there was always an intention that it would support a clinical guideline. So the HTA identified and described those interventions currently in use in Ireland at the time. It reviewed the safety of those. There was a systematic review and meta-analysis of the clinical effectiveness. 3 separate subgroups were looked at: general population, mental health services, and pregnant women. It looked at the cost effectiveness of these various interventions, looked at the impact of changes in the mix of the interventions. It also looked at the ethical, legal, and organizational implications of the changes to provision of smoking cessation services. So all of these various aspects were synthesized informally and developed up into advice to the minister. Next slide, please. So the clinical guideline on tobacco addiction is currently in development. They're now at the stage of drafting recommendations, and the recommendations cover advice to healthcare workers on discussing smoking cessation and its benefits, the cessation interventions themselves, and individual public preferences. So again, it's quite linked to the HTA as it was intended to be. However, it's slightly broader in some of its scope. The guideline will also review the clinical and cost effectiveness evidence and detailed an implementation plan and a budget impact assessment. I've highlighted here the fact that it has a cost effective evidence assessment and a budget impact assessment of the guideline, because these are standard practice within Ireland. So all of our guidelines, our national clinical guidelines, will have to review the cost effectiveness evidence to support the recommendations, and they also have to develop a budget impact and assessment. So these, I know, it isn't standard practice internationally, but it is within Ireland. Next slide, please. Oh. So just to reflect on the two different scenarios. So I kind of gave a really high level overview of what was involved, but I think what's important is kind of looking forward, and kind of the focus of this session is how we can link these together and where it works and where perhaps it could be improved. So for the hepatitis C, it was identified after the development of the guideline that was an evidence gap that needed to be filled with the HTA, whereas for the smoking cessation, it was in anticipation for the need of evidence that the HTA was requested. So some of the really positive points that came out when we were conducting this work is that you built on the research for the previous product. So for the hepatitis C HTA, we were able to build on some of the evidence that had been gathered for the guideline. And similarly, for the smoking cessation, it's really building on what was done in the HTA. There's one of the other things which we think is particularly important is the overlap of stakeholders. Ola, your screen is changing there. So the overlap of the stakeholders involved in both the guideline development group and the HTA expert advisory group. So both the HTA and a clinical guideline will have the group of stakeholders. And what we found is that maybe it's due to the small size of the country, but it was really useful for us to have a number of these stakeholders common to both groups. So for the hepatitis C, we had 3 of the stakeholders were on both the guideline development group and the HTA and the expert advice group for the HTA, and that was 6 for smoking cessation. Now these groups usually have about 20 to 24 individuals on them, so that level of overlap was really important to ensure that knowledge and understanding was maintained, so they had good background knowledge on it. However, I think it was good as well to have the new members to include that broader insight, because the 2 products essentially were different. Another thing that was quite useful within the Irish context is there's clearly defined roles for what clinical guideline is and how it informs practice, and also what a HTA does and how it informs practice. So it's very clear in our mind and in those developing the guidelines are the HTA where those lie. Some of the negative points or challenges, I think, with these 2 case studies was the time delay. In both cases, it was up to 3 years. Partly, some of that, the 2020, that everything's been delayed a few months at this point, but it has led to a duplication of work because, as time moves on, evidence moves on. So we have needed to go back and do some of those evidence pieces have to be relooked at. There's also, for the smoking cessation, a lot of the team within HIPCA was involved in the HTA, and we can build on that for the smoking cessation guideline. For hepatitis C, it was a different cohort of researchers who do the evidence synthesis to support that. So there's a bit of it's not as seamless a transition, I guess, for the guideline there. The different frameworks as well around the decision making. So for guidelines now in Ireland, we use the Great Evidence Decision Making framework. And we've used different frameworks in the past, but that's the one we use now. Whereas in the HTA, there isn't a framework as such, but it's more an informal consideration of the domains. Most of the similar aspects will be considered, but they, it does mean there's a little bit of alignment that needs to be done. Next slide, please. So my thoughts and reflections from myself and the team here on the future. So in Ireland, we have a small team now within HICO who are supporting both guideline development groups and HTAs, and this will increase the pool of researchers with that methodological knowledge across both guidelines and HTA. And I guess that organically leads itself to more harmonization of methods as we work closely together and we see what works across both. So for example, one of these things that we've been doing here is GRADE. So GRADE came into clinical guidelines before it came into HTA. So we're kind of learning across the groups there. Time delays. How can we identify gaps earlier? Because for the smoking cessation, when the gap was identified earlier, we were able to do that information for the HTA to inform the guideline, which feels a lot more, seamless, more transition than for the guidelines where the evidence gap was identified as a recommendation to be pulled together. So if we could find a way to identify those gaps earlier, and then potentially could we have the health technology and guidelines be developed in tandem? This might prevent the time delays, might prevent some of that duplication. The other thing we were thinking about for the future is around those frameworks. So the evidence decision-making framework for the guidelines and the HTA, that informal consideration of the domains. They are very, very similar when you look into them, but it might be, I think it's a transparency and maybe more closely alignment of those might be enabled, easier collaboration, particularly around those stakeholders around the table. But I mean, our ultimate reflection is it's a promising beginning, and we're hoping that successful completion of these two products will hopefully lead to further collaboration in the future. So thank you very much, and I'd like to thank everybody for their patience in bearing with me with those technical issues.
Thank you, Shelly. I'm so glad that we were able to figure it out and that you were able to present, because these were really excellent examples. Muna, have you seen the questions in the chat?
Yeah, sorry, can we take 5 minutes more from your time just to answer some question?
Yes.
Okay, so
yes.
We have many questions here. I'm just trying to pick up some of them. I'm sorry. We won't be able for sure to answer all the questions. For example, are the clinical guidelines mandatory to follow for the healthcare services in Ireland? This question is for Shelly.
Sorry, could you just repeat that again? There are the clinical guidelines
mandatory to follow for the healthcare services in Ireland?
Yes, so the clinical guidelines, these national clinical guidelines, they're endorsed by the minister, and then there is a requirement that organisations are audited against those. So yes, not all clinical guidelines, but those that go through the NCEC process, they get endorsed by our health minister.
Okay, so another question is, sorry, so the question, with that in mind, when do you do a cost effectiveness analysis? Do you use only studies that have access effectiveness, or do you also include efficacy studies?
Education studies. So we have used, yes, we do all sorts of, it's not just clinical effectiveness, especially within the guideline setting. We would look at the education aspects. So there have been guidelines of education. There's been guidelines that have included qualitative reviews around service provision aspects there. So that, yes, we would include whatever is appropriate really to inform the whatever decision it is, if that makes sense. It isn't just clinical effectiveness, no.
Thank you, Shelley. This question is for Dalia. To which extent we should also involve regulators in the collaboration?
Thanks, Mona. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this is very important. Actually, regulators need to definitely be involved. So in our project, for example, work package 4, there is another task that looks at HTA and organizations and collaboration with regulatory agencies. What we are seeing and noticing is that actually there is much more formal collaboration on the regulatory agency front with HTA organizations than between HTA and clinical guidelines. Because I think that's by virtue of the nature of the technology appraisal process and the reliance marketing authorization to start the process. So definitely, so that's why our work package actually is looking at the synergies across all between HTA organizations, because we all need to talk to each other as well, and between HTA regulatory and clinical guideline developers.
In the same framework, somebody else asked the question, which 6 HTA agency are you using for the document review? It's for you, Dalia.
I don't have the details of the exact HTA agencies, but I can definitely share these if we get the information of who asked the question, and I'm happy to share that.
Okay, thank you. Another question, under WP4, could you help extend a little on how synergy and international consensus themes are approached, especially in harmonizing HTA and guideline recommendation between countries? Sorry, Daria, was it clear?
Sorry, I didn't hear you well, Mona. Can you repeat that?
Sorry. Okay. Under WP4, could you help expand a little on how synergy and international consensus themes are approached, especially on harmonizing HTA and guideline recommendations between countries?
Within the context of HTX project, you mean?
I guess so.
Well, as I said, we are looking in terms of the synergies that is currently happening already. So we are looking at what is available through looking at this by using the information from the questionnaires and analyzing them. But also we have the document review to inform that. So this is looking at what is the current landscape, what is happening across these HTA agencies and clinical guideline developers. But we are not, as I said, we are not looking wider in terms of internationally what is happening.
Okay, thank you, Dalia. A final question, and I'm sorry we won't be able to address all the questions. So Grace, she asked, I have a quick question about how to select the topic to go through the HTX method. If it is possible for you, could you share with us more?
Sorry, again, I didn't hear you, sorry.
It's about how to select the topic to go through to the HTX method.
Well, we are, do you mean, I think that the question is it about HTA methods in NICE or HTX, the HTX project?
HTX project.
We already have 4 case studies already agreed, because we have already proposed these in the project, and they are built into our work packages. So we are not taking any new case studies at the moment. And these are, as I said, head and neck cancer, multiple sclerosis, diabetes, and MDS, which is a rare disease. We try to choose areas where there is some challenges for health technology assessment. For example, sequences of treatments, combinations of treatments, and these are rare diseases. So our 4 case studies represent a range of complex HTA situations. Okay,
thank you very much, Dalia. I think it's time to wrap up. So Holger, do you have something to add?
Yeah, that's great. So thanks very much to both of you, Shelly and Dalia. That was really very informative. So as I said, we'll have more of these webinars. And for instance, Lubna Al Ansari asked the question, what those who are starting on a joint HTA and guideline program should look out for. And these are the type of things that I think these webinars will actually bring to the surface. And we hope that we can, as I said, learn from a few more examples. One of the questions or comments related to resources or existing overviews of which HTA agencies and guideline developers are working together. There was a point made about whether or not the same teams are doing the HTA assessment and the practice guideline, and there are a few examples globally that we intend to bring in. Close collaboration, for instance, in Brazil, there's a paper coming out that describes a new way of fostering collaboration within the Ministry of Health. So those are some of the issues that we will be addressing. There is 2 questions that I think will be part of future webinars, and one is, what is the difference? What is the similarities between HTA and guideline development that was asked here? I think there's also opportunity for laying out some of the processes and dealing with misunderstandings. So for instance, that clinical practice guidelines only deal with clinical effects as opposed to cost. That depends on the framework that you're using. And I think, Shelly, you've provided a good example where if you use the ETDs, resource utilization cost would always be part of it. So those are topics for the future. You can go to the GIN website and connect with GINAHTA and suggest future topics. I stop by thanking everybody. Apologies for the technical glitches that we will be dealing with in the future. And thank the speakers and Muna again. Bye bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye to everybody.
Bye.